In this example, I want to take a look at IAM policies. And when we first looked at IAM, we looked at how can we create users and user accounts, groups associated with those user accounts. We added permissions to the groups so that the users that belong to different groups would then have permission to access resources within AWS. But there were some limitations to that approach. And by limitations, what I mean is if I skip over to S3, there's certain actions that I can take within S3. So I could go back to the buckets and I could create a bucket. I could create a folder. I could delete a file. I could upload a new file. All of those things are considered actions within the AWS ecosystem, and we can further refine that to say they're actions within S3 that AWS knows about. Okay, so really that's how I would interact with S3 or through those actions. And if I jump back over to IAM, I can look at some of those. So if I look at my user groups, I have the administrator's user group. And right now in the permissions, I added a policy to say that that administrator group has administrator access. If I go add a permission and I attach a policy, I can look at the different S3 policies that Amazon has written, right? So I could give access to S3, I can give full access. I could give read-only access to S3, right? So AWS knows about some of those actions that I might want to grant for my individual user groups. Okay, but what AWS doesn't know about is if I cancel out of this, what AWS doesn't know about is the fact that I'm going to be adding resources to my S3 bucket. So I'm going to be adding files and I'm going to be adding folders. And AWS has no idea about what resources I'd actually add to my S3 bucket. So I can add folders to this bucket, I can add files to this bucket, and I might want to grant certain users access to certain resources within my bucket. Okay, and AWS can't predict what resources I'm going to create, so it can't create policies for those resources that don't even exist. Okay, so what you end up having to do is when we added the permission, we were just looking at the built-in policies. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to look at how do I create an inline policy to define a policy for resources that I've created after the fact that are not necessarily related to the Amazon actions where there's a built-in policy. Okay, so for this example, what I want to do is I want to create a couple of folders. I want to create a development folder. And then I also want to create a financials folder. And the idea with those two folders is I want to have a group of accountants. So I do not have that user group yet in IAM. I want to create it. I want to have a group of accountants that can access the financials folder. And then for the development, what I want to do is I want to have a group of software developers that can access the development folder. Okay, but otherwise, if you're not a member of the accountants group, you shouldn't be able to access the financials. And if you're not a member of the software devs, you shouldn't be able to access the development folder. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, so I'm going to go over back to IAM, and I'm going to create two users. I'm going to create a user called Accountant1. I'm going to provide the AWS Management Council access. I'm going to set a complex password, and I'm not going to force them to create it because I want it to be something that I can remember. So I'm going to go ahead and create that account. I'm not going to add them to a user group yet. I'm actually going to create the group right now. I'm going to call it Accountants. And then I'm going to add that user to the group. And I'm going to create the user. So Accountant1 belongs to the accountants. Okay, so Accountant1, if I look in groups, they belong to the accountants group. And I'm going to do the same thing for my web developer. So I'm going to create a user, dev1. I'm going to provide management access, management council access. I want it to be an IAM user. I'm going to specify a custom password. I'm going to create a new group called devs. Okay, and I'm going to add them to the devs group, and I'm going to create that user. Okay, so now I have my dev1 belongs to the devs group. Okay, and right now, if I go ahead and log in with dev1, so I'm going to go up to my file menu, I'm going to open up a new incognito window, and I'm going to go to the AWS console. I'm just going to sign in, so Brian's AWS dev1, and then that password. Okay, so I'm in the console homepage, and I'm just going to go ahead and click through this menu so it's not going to annoy me. And I'm going to try to go over to S3 with that dev1 account. And you're going to notice I get error messages about the fact that I can't see the buckets. So if I actually want to look at the buckets or anything like that, I don't have access to it. So if I try to create a bucket, I'm not going to be able to. If I go back to buckets, you're going to see that I don't have permission to list the buckets. I don't have any permission for S3, and that's because I created the user account and I created the group, but I didn't actually assign any permissions to that user or group. Okay? And the same would apply for my accountant1 user account. Okay, so right now I'm just dealing with dev1, but the same issues would come up whether I'm using the dev1 user account or the accountant1 user account. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to start giving access to the user. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that they can list the buckets in my S3 account. Okay, so I'm going to jump back over to my non-incognito window. Okay, so here's my non-incognito window, and I have two users, accountant1 and dev1, and I want to grant both of these accounts. I want both of them to have the ability to see all of the buckets in S3. Okay, so I don't want to do that for accountants or devs. I actually want to do it for both. So what I would suggest is that there's probably a situation where dev1 and accountant1 don't necessarily belong just to devs and accountants, but they're probably a member of the employees group. So they're all employees. One's a dev, one's an accountant. So I'm going to go back to user groups and I'm going to add another group called employees. So kind of like a parent group. And I'm going to make accountant1 and dev1 a member of the employees group. Okay, so now I have employees, and accountant1 and dev1 are members of that same group. Okay, so now if I'm looking at my users, accountant1 and dev1 actually belong to two groups. Okay, so the first group that I want to access is the employees group. And the employees group, the idea is if I jump back over to my incognito window, because dev1 and accountant1 are both an employee, then they both should be able to list the buckets. Okay, so let's go ahead and fix that right now. So I'm going to jump back over to the non-incognito window. I'm going to go to my user group. I'm going to go to permissions. And I want to add a permission, but I don't want to attach a policy because those are built-in AWS policies about resources and actions that AWS already knows about. I want to actually create a policy beyond that, which is for my specific bucket, for Brian's Fall 2024 bucket. Okay, so I'm going to create an inline policy. And I get like a little wizard, so I get a visual editor or I can switch to the JSON editor. So I typically will switch back and forth between the two. So I'm going to choose my service, which is S3. The actions that I want to allow the list bucket action. Okay, and if I just use the list bucket action, what's going to happen is I'm going to specify my bucket. So I'm going to go ahead and add my Amazon resource name that's going to say for my specific bucket. But in this case, since I'm talking about sorry, I don't want list bucket. I want to be able to list all of my buckets so that the users can see all the buckets. In this case, I'm not talking about one specific bucket. I'm talking about being able to list all of the buckets. So list all my buckets is the permission that I want to access here. So I'm going to go ahead and click next. I have to give this a policy name. So it's basically saying name this new policy that you're creating, and I'm going to call this my employee list all buckets policy. I'm just giving it a useful name. And that employee list all buckets is then tied to the employees group. And now if I jump over to the incognito window, what I should see if I refresh this is that I'm able to list all of the buckets. I'm not able to go any further. I'm not able to create a bucket or do anything like that because I didn't add that permission. So if I try to create a bucket and I say, here's my unique name, and I try to create the bucket, what's going to happen is I'm going to get a permission error. Okay, so that still exists. I also have the issue of if I try to go into a bucket, I don't have permission to actually see the contents of the bucket. Okay, so I have insufficient permissions to list the objects. Nothing has changed in that sense. The only thing I've done is I've granted access to list all of the buckets. Okay, so that permission is there for all employees. Okay, I would also like all employees to be able to go into Brian's Fall 2024 and see the contents of Brian's Fall 2024. So I want to add that permission next. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add another permission for the employees group because this is for both the accountants and the devs. And the idea here is that they should be able to go into the Brian's Fall 2024 and list the files and folders that are in that bucket. Not necessarily getting into financials or development, but they should be able to get into the Brian's Fall 2024 bucket. Okay, so I'm going to go back over here. I want to create a new policy. So I'm going to create an inline policy. The service, again, is going to be S3. And in this case, the action that I want is to be able to list my bucket. And if I use list bucket right now and I don't specify any additional details, all I do is I say list a specific bucket. So I don't want you to be able to go into all of the buckets. I don't want you to go into brianwitkowski.com or www.brianwitkowski.com. I only want you to be able to go into Brian's Fall 2024. So I want to be able to create a policy for that. So I'm going to add this Amazon resource name to say this is restricted to just Brian's Fall 2024. So if I add that ARN, I have to add my bucket name, Brian's Fall 2024. And notice it automatically fills in my Amazon resource name. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add that ARN. And I'm going to go ahead and hit next. I have to add the policy name. So employee list bucket. Okay, so I'm going to create that policy. So I've done that, and now if I jump over to my incognito window, you'll notice that it's kind of fixed. Okay, so I can see all of the contents of that bucket. But I can also go a little further than I should be able to. So because I granted that permission to list the bucket, I'm able to go into the financials folder, and I'm able to go into the development folder without an issue. Okay, so I'm able to access those financials and the development folder. To kind of further this example, I'm going to go back over to the administrative account in this S3 bucket. Okay, so financials right now is empty and development is empty. What I want to do is I actually want to add a file for both of those. So I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio Code. Okay, and I'm going to say I want a new file. So a new text file, financials. I'm going to save that on my desktop. as a text file. And then I'm going to create another new file, and I'm going to call this my dev file. And I'm just going to save that as dev.txt. Okay, and then I'm going to upload those files to the corresponding folders. And that's just to verify that we can actually see those files in folders. Okay, so this is in the financials folder, so I'm going to go ahead and upload financials.txt. Okay, and then if I go back to my bucket, I can go into the development and I can upload my dev.txt. Okay, and that's in the development folder. So depending on the folder, I have a file. So development has dev.txt, financials has financials.txt. Okay, so I do have that file within those specific folders. And if I jump back over to the incognito window, because I granted that permission to list the bucket, now I can go into the development folder, and if I refresh this, you'll notice I'm able to actually see the file. And if I go into the financials, same thing, I'm able to see the file. Okay, and all of that was a result of the fact that over in my policy, I said that the employee should be able to list the bucket. Okay, so this policy right here, this employee list bucket policy, allowed me to list all of the contents of the bucket and dig into the individual folders within that bucket. What I want to do is I actually want to make this a little more restricted in that I only want them to be able to list the contents from that root directory. So if you go into the bucket, you should be able to see the root of the bucket, but I don't want you necessarily to dig any deeper. I don't want you to go into the financials folder, and I don't want you to go into the dev folder. So I'm going to put some restrictions on this list bucket. Okay, so if I go back over to the visual editor, I'm actually modifying the permissions here. I'm going to go to the visual editor. Okay, and I'm going back into this one action. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some request conditions. Okay, so the request conditions that I have to add, it's kind of strange how it's done, but if I look at this development folder, the list bucket is a read action, and what ends up happening is that I have this prefix, which is development, right here. So up in the URL, I have this prefix, which is development, and then I have this /, which is the delimiter. Okay, so what I actually need to do is I have to add two conditions. So I'm going to add another condition. I'm going to add an S3 condition, which is the S3 prefix. And I want that to be string equals. And I want you to be able to make sure that the prefix is equal to an empty string. So the value I'm just putting is double quote, and we'll come back to this because this doesn't necessarily work from the visual editor, but essentially what I'm saying double quote is I want it to be an empty string, so I don't want there to be a prefix. Okay, and then the other condition that I have to have is the delimiter is going to be equal to a /. So I'm going to say I want to add an S3 delimiter, and the delimiter is also equal to that /. Okay, so I added those request conditions, and if I look over at the JSON, you'll see that the prefix is not necessarily what I wanted. I want it to be an empty string, but you notice it's trying to escape the double quotes. So what I actually want is the prefix to be an empty string, so I'm going to do that manually through JSON, not through the visual editor. Okay, and the delimiter equal to a /. And what this is doing is saying, yeah, I want you to be able to list the bucket, but I only want you to do that if the prefix is an empty string and the delimiter is a /, meaning the root of the bucket is really what that meaning is. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next and save those changes. Okay, so now I have the list bucket, but I've restricted it to just the root of the bucket. So now all employees should be able to list the root of the bucket. Okay, so if I jump over to my incognito window, I can test that out. So I can go to the root of the bucket and make sure that I can still see the contents from the root of the bucket because there is no delimiter. Okay, and there is no prefix. Okay, so the delimiter is still a forward slash, but there is no prefix there. Okay, if I try to go into financials now, I don't have permission to view it. If I try to go into development, I don't have permission to do it. I'm only able to list the contents of the root of the bucket. Okay? So I think we're okay there. So I didn't grant too much access. Okay, so all employees can get to this point. They can see all the buckets. That was the first policy that we wrote. And then once we're in a bucket, they can see the contents of the bucket, but they shouldn't be able to go any further nesting. Okay, and I don't want them to be able to. Okay, so right now I'm logged in with the dev1 account, and the dev1 account should be able to go into the development folder. And what I actually want is for this dev1 account to have basically full access within that dev1 folder. I want them to be able to list the contents of that dev1 folder. I want them to be able to create new files, new folders. I want them to be able to delete files and folders. Okay, so I want them to have access to that folder. And there's really two things I have to do. And I kind of separate the two. The first is I want you to be able to list the bucket, but only so list bucket would allow me to see all the files. I want you to be able to list the bucket for this specific folder. Okay, so we're going to do that with request conditions. So that's the first thing I want to do. And then the second thing I want to do is I want to grant access to all of those actions, like creating new files, reading files, updating files, deleting files. So all of those different actions I want to grant access to as well, and that'll be a separate process. So two different policies that I want to add for the dev group. One to list the contents of the development folder, and then the second one to provide access to actually work within the folder. Okay, so I'm going to jump back over to the administrative account, and I'm going to go back to my user groups, and I'm going to look at the devs. Okay, and I'm going to go to permissions. I want to add a permission, and again, this is going to be an S3 permission. I want you to be able to list the bucket. Okay, so I want to be able to do that. It's for a specific resource. So my bucket name again is Brian's Fall 2024. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and add that ARN. But my request conditions, I only want this to occur for the times when the user is actually inside of the development folder. Okay, so in my request conditions, we're going to have request conditions for the delimiter and the prefix again. So really what we want to be able to do is we want to say our S3 prefix and the operator that we want here. This is a little bit strange. Okay, so I want to explain this in a little bit more detail. If I jump over to Visual Studio Code, if I'm looking at Brian's Fall 2024, that bucket, I have a file index.html, and I have a file packers.png, and then what you think of it is you think there's a folder called financials and you think that there's a folder called development. But the way AWS thinks about it is it thinks that there's a folder called development, and it's going to do is it's going to name all of the files in the development folder with that prefix. So this is actually just a file with a file name that has that development / prefix. And then for financials, there's a financials folder, and then there's a financials.txt file. Okay, so there's not actually folders. What there is there's prefixes on the files within those folders. So It looks like a folder. AWS calls it a folder because that's what we're comfortable with. But the way they actually manage it is they actually just include that folder name in the file name as a prefix. Okay? So what I want to do is I want to say I want you to have access to all of the development folder, and I want you to be able to see everything underneath it, but I only want to allow that if the prefix is development. Okay, and here's where it gets a little bit funny. What I want to do is I want to say all of the files underneath development. So I want to say development /star. So what I want to do is I want to do something like the prefix is going to be development /star. But if you remember back to your SQL statements, when you use a wildcard character, I don't use an equality sign. So I don't say, if I'm searching for a person whose name starts with S, I don't say where name equals and then something like S star. Like that's not how the where clause will work. What ends up happening is it would be looking for a name that is specifically S star. It's not going to find anything. I want the star to be treated more like a wildcard character, so any name that starts with S. And the way I do that is where name is like S star. So I have to do something similar here where I'm going to say where the prefix is like development / and then I can use that wildcard character. So my operator in this case is where the string is like, and then I can use development /star. Okay. And then I can add another condition, and again it's going to be the S3 delimiter. And again it's going to be string like /. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit next. And I have to give it a policy name. And I'm going to go ahead and call this policy list development folder. Okay, and if I look at this, I really want to look at the JSON. As you get more comfortable with these policies, the JSON will make more sense. So I have two string-like conditions where the prefix is development *, the delimiter is / for that bucket. So I'm saying for the development folder within the bucket, really, I'm allowing the list bucket action. Okay, and if I've done this correctly, I should be able to go over and look in the development folder, and now because I'm logged in as a developer and that new policy is in place, I should be able to see the contents of the bucket. Okay, so that's the first policy. It still won't allow me to create a new folder. So like let's say I wanted to create like an images folder. Okay, you'll see I have insufficient permission to create the folder. It won't allow me to delete the file. Right? I can try to confirm it and say, yep, I want to delete that file. But you'll see I get insufficient permissions to do that. Okay, so I'm not able to do those things. All I'm able to do is I'm able to see the contents of that folder. Okay, and that's because we added that list bucket permission for that specific folder. Okay, so I want to do the same thing, but this time I want to do it for allowing the user to create new files, delete files, create folders, things like that, manage that development folder. Okay, so I want to add one more policy, so I'm going to go back over to the devs group, and I want to create a new policy. So I'm going to add another policy, creating another inline policy. It's for S3. And in this case, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to read. So I want to be able to get an object that's reading a file. If I have versioning, I want to be able to get an object version. So I want those two. And then under write, I want to be able to do a delete object version. And then I would say I want to be able to add new objects, so put object. So those are the 5 that I typically will do. is get object version, delete object version, put object. Okay, and then I'm going to have a specific object ARN, so I'm going to add the ARN. So my bucket name is going to be Brian's Fall 2024. And then I specifically want to say my folder, which is development/star. Okay. And I'm going to add that ARN. And then I'm not going to add request conditions. Okay, and we'll get into that in a second, but I'm going to skip adding request conditions. I'm just going to go ahead and hit next. And then I'm going to name the policy read, write, delete, dev folder. Okay, I'm going to create the policy. Okay, and I want to skip over to my browser. I want to skip over to the incognito window, and I'm logged in as a developer right now, and I just want to verify that that permission actually took place, so I'm going to try to create a new folder. So I'm going to create a folder called images. And it's still saying I have insufficient permission to create a folder. Let's try that again. Let's try images. I just refreshed it. Okay, and you'll notice that it's saying it's missing the S3 put object action. And that's interesting. I think I should have the S3 put object action right now. So I'm not sure why. You'll see I'm getting access denied, but I should have that put object action there for the development folder. So here's the put object. I'm allowing to the development/star. I think that should be okay. That certainly looks reasonable to me. And now if I come back over here and I try to create a folder, I just want to refresh the permissions, and I'm going to create a folder called images. It's still saying I have insufficient permission. So I kind of think that my permissions have just not been reflected here. So if I try to create a folder called images, and I create the folder, I'm getting insufficient permission to create the folder. I'm not exactly sure why I'm getting that specific error, but I am able to upload files. So if I add a file and I add financials to the development folder, okay, so that seems to work okay. I'm able to delete that file, right? So if I want to delete the file after the fact, that seems to work okay. But I am still encountering the error where I try to create a folder. So if I try to create the images folder, it's telling me that I don't have permission to create the folder. So I'm not sure why that is the case, to be honest with you. If I go back over to my policy, this all looks fine. So my resource is development/star. And I wonder if it's only allowing me to go one level deep into the development folder, and it won't actually let me create a new folder within the development folder. So for some reason I'm not able to create a folder, even though I think that's just the put object action. Okay, and I've done this before where I haven't had any issues creating subfolders. So maybe I'm doing something wrong, but I don't think so. Okay, so we can add new files, that's the put object. We can delete those files, that's the delete object. If we have versioning enabled on our bucket, the delete object version is allowing us to delete specific versions of an object. We didn't really talk about get object, and what get object is if I were to look at a specific file, I'm able to get that object. Okay, so I'm able to get into that file and see, what is the object URL, what is the S3 URI. So I'm able to see that specific file. Okay, so that's where those permissions are coming into play. Okay, so if we look at this as a whole, we really have two policies for our devs. We have one policy that allows you to list the development folder, which is the list bucket policy. And in this list bucket policy, we had some conditions, right? So if I open that up, we had some conditions. Okay, where the string like, the prefix was development/star, and the delimiter is /. We had those conditions. Whereas if I look at the read, write, delete dev folder, we didn't have those conditions. All we had was our resource matching that development folder. So your follow-up question hopefully is, in the case of all the actions, like being able to add new files, delete files, things like that, I didn't have a condition, whereas when I was trying to list the bucket, I did have the condition. Okay, and the reason for that is if I go back over to my incognito window, when I'm listing the folder, you'll notice up above we have the prefix being development. It's there as part of the URL. And that's because we're doing a read, which indicates we're doing an HTTP GET, which indicates that our parameters are going to be passed through the URL. Okay, so all of those things kind of cascade through to say, hey, because we're doing a read, that means we're doing an HTTP GET, and because we're doing an HTTP GET, my variables are passed through the URL. I'm able to look at those URL variables and then have conditions on those URL variables. Whereas if I contrast that to, I want to upload a new file, okay, and I want to upload a new file, when I actually do the add file, I'm actually doing an HTTP put or post, depending on how they've implemented it, but post would indicate that I'm creating a new record, put would be indicating that I'm doing an update, likely doing a post. When I add a new file, we have the prefix here, but not through the actual post of a new file. So those actions that we have defined over here in our policy, when we're dealing with those, it's not an HTTP GET, it's an HTTP put or an HTTP post or an HTTP delete, meaning that that prefix variable is not going to show up in the URL because we're not doing an HTTP GET. Okay, and because that variable doesn't exist, then we can't have the conditions on those URL variables. Okay, so that's kind of why we broke up those different policies. The first one to be able to list the bucket, and then the second one for all of those actions included in the folder. Okay? So really what we're talking about is we're really getting granular about the resources within our S3 bucket. So we're able to say, for this S3 bucket, we really only want you to be able to see these resources or these other resources. So we don't have to give full access to all of the files and all of the folders in our S3 bucket. And the idea here is that the security rule of thumb is you should have access to the resources that you need and the actions that you need, but you shouldn't have access to anything beyond that. Okay, so we want to give the least possible access that we can in order for you to continue to do your job. So that might be that we get really granular and say you have access to the development folder, but you don't have access to the financials folder. Okay, so if we were going to carry this forward, right now we have our devs group, and our devs group has a couple of policies attached to it. So one to list the development folder and one for all the actions in the development folder. And if we were to carry this forward, we'd go over to our user groups, we'd go to the accountants, and then we'd do the same thing for the accountants, but for our financials folder. Okay? And that would then have all of the kind of same setup, just accessing a different folder and assigning that to a different group. Okay, so the reality is, if we really want to be secure and strong with our permissions and our security within AWS S3, we're likely doing this a lot. Okay, so if we're going to write a new function and we need access to DynamoDB, we may need only access to a specific table, or we may need read-only access to a specific table. For this course, we're not going to get into the granular details for all of the different services. It's really kind of this video demoing how I would go about doing it, and we're doing it against S3. But the reality is we probably want to do that for all of our services against all of the resources that we're accessing whenever we have one role accessing a service within AWS. Okay, but for the purposes of this class, in order to save our resources and save our time and energy, what we're going to do is we're going to use a lot of the built-in policies. So if I know that a group is going to need access to DynamoDB, so for instance, let's say the accountants need access to DynamoDB, I'm going to go over to permissions, and instead of strictly enforcing the fact that the accountants only need access to a specific table, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the accountants need access to DynamoDB. I'm going to use one of the policies that AWS has built for me. I'm going to search for DynamoDB, and then I have a couple of options, and I'm going to choose one of those options. Okay, so likely I either need full access or read-only access, depending on what I'm doing. And granted, there's better ways to do that, but in order to conserve our time and resources, we're going to use those inline policies that are already built for us. Okay? So this is just a demo to show you how I might write an AWS IAM policy so that I can access a specific resource that I've built after the fact that Amazon didn't know about when I signed up for my account.